I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old Tom there on not.
I recently posted a video on my channel about what happened to the most iconic Confederate leaders and generals after the war. At the end of the video, I said if it did well, I would make a part 2. That video became my most popular video yet, by far, so here are 10 more Confederate leaders and generals and what they did after the war. Or, in the case of A.P. Hill and Bloody Bill Anderson, who perished during the war, how has their legacy and impact lived on? James Longstreet. James Longstreet was an extremely talented and strategically gifted lieutenant general. He served under General Lee for a majority of the war, but his achievements were often overlooked due to his regular disagreements with his superiors. Immediately after the war, Lee, Longstreet, and other Confederate generals were indicted by the grand jury for the crime of treason. General Grant, however, convinced President Johnson to drop the charges, as charging Confederate leaders with treason broke the terms signed at Appomattox. I hope I pronounced that better this time because a lot of you complained in the last video. And the charges were dropped. Longstreet moved to New Orleans and immediately began supporting Reconstruction, black rights, and the abolition of slavery. This made him very unpopular among his fellow former Confederates, especially after he campaigned for and supported General Grant in his successful bid for the presidency. Due to his support for Republicans and Reconstruction, many Southern authors and historians blamed Longstreet for the Confederates' loss and diminished his accomplishments in the eye of the public. In 1873, Longstreet commanded a force of police officers and black militiamen in an attempt to hold back anti-Reconstruction white supremacist protesters as they marched on the Louisiana state capitol. His role in this event and army of black soldiers only made him more unpopular with Southerners. In his later life, he worked in politics, holding positions such as United States Minister Resident to the Ottoman Empire, U.S. Marshal of Georgia, and U.S. Commissioner of Railroads, before moving to Georgia where he would pass away on his turkey farm. His reputation, although tarnished by Southern historians, has been largely saved by his second wife, who worked very hard to give her husband the honor he deserved. William T. Anderson. William T. Anderson was perhaps the most notable American guerrilla fighter. Born in Kentucky circa 1840, Bloody Bill, as he was nicknamed, fled to Missouri after murdering his father's murderer and joining a group of Confederate guerrilla fighters. Bloody Bill was a violent and ruthless man who took part in the Lawrence Massacre, the Battle of Baxter Springs, and the Centralia Massacre. He regularly killed Union civilians and unarmed Union soldiers. He died in battle a little under a year before the war would end. Historians often debate over Bloody Bill's legacy, with most considering him to be a sadistic killer. Many others feel he illustrates the effects war can have on a man, and he is no worse than other Confederate generals. He is sometimes called the bloodiest man in America's bloodiest war. A.P. Hill. A.P. Hill was an extremely gifted Confederate general who, like Bloody Bill, perished before the end of the war. He served under General Jackson and made a name for himself in the battles of Cedar Mountain, Second Bull Run, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. Following General Jackson's death, Hill was promoted and served directly under General Lee. Illness often forced Hill to take breaks from the war, and he was killed at the Third Battle of Petersburg. Hill had long been an iconic figure. Despite his loyalty to the Confederates, the U.S. military named Fort A.P. Hill in Virginia after him and named a Liberty ship, the SS A.P. Hill, in his honor. His remains were also buried under a statue of Hill in Richmond. Unfortunately, in recent years, Fort A.P. Hill has been renamed, and his statue was removed from Richmond, much to his family's dismay. He is still remembered for his excellence as a general, despite his monuments being erased. Judah P. Benjamin. One of the most common requests I got from my last video was to talk about Judah P. Benjamin. Judah P. Benjamin was born in the U.S. Virgin Islands, at the time occupied by the British, to Sephardic Jewish parents. His parents immigrated to the States in search of opportunities and settled in Charleston, South Carolina. Benjamin became a prominent lawyer, planter, and slave owner, and was voted to the U.S. Senate in 1852. Benjamin became the first Jew who had not renounced his faith to serve in a cabinet position in North America. While a senator, Benjamin was a strong supporter of slavery, and when Louisiana seceded in 1861, Benjamin resigned from the Senate and became the Attorney General for the Confederate States. Benjamin worked closely with President Davis and was promoted to Secretary of War, then Secretary of State. While in the latter position, Benjamin unsuccessfully attempted to gain recognition for the Confederate States from Britain and France. Benjamin and President Davis fled Richmond together in 1865, but separated before Davis was captured in Georgia. Benjamin successfully fled to Britain, where he had a very successful career as an English barrister. He lived out the rest of his life in Europe and died in Paris in 1884. He is often considered one of the most important and intelligent figures of the Confederacy. Jubal Early. Jubal Early was a very skilled Confederate general who served under General Jackson. After the Confederate forces in Virginia surrendered, Early fled by horseback to Texas in hopes of finding a Confederate force who had not yet surrendered. After having no luck, he fled to Mexico and from there sailed to Cuba, finally settling in Toronto, Canada. After President Johnson pardoned him, he returned to the U.S., but unlike many other Confederates, he remained staunchly pro-Confederate and refused to show loyalty to the United States. He popularized and supported the Lost Cause movement and supported white supremacy, calling freed slaves barbarous natives of Africa. He died in Virginia in 1894 and remains one of the few notable Confederates who never changed or renounced his beliefs. William H. Norris. William H. Norris was not as notable for his time in the war, but rather for his achievements afterwards. Norris served in the Alabama state legislature and in the Alabama House of Representatives in the 1830s and 1840s. He strongly supported the Confederates during the war, but he did not hold an official Confederate position. After the war, Norris and 30 other Confederate families sailed to Brazil and settled in the area that is today Americana, Brazil. He purchased 500 acres of Brazilian land that reminded him of Alabama and allowed the 30 families to settle on that land. Emperor Pedro II of Brazil had been very sympathetic to the Confederates, and slavery would remain legal in Brazil until 1888. So Brazil became a popular place of refuge for former Confederates. While in Brazil, Norris served as imperial congressman for the state of Sao Paulo and became a colonel in the Brazilian National Guard. He passed away in 1893. Today, Americana, a city of nearly 250,000 people, has many cultural similarities to the United States, and the town still holds a Confederate festival every year. Joseph Wheeler. Joseph Wheeler was a skilled cavalry general during the Civil War and took part in more than 10 important battles. After the war, he was one of the very few Confederates who were allowed to rejoin the U.S. Army, where he served as a major general in Cuba and in the Philippines. Wheeler was also elected into the House of Representatives from 1881 to 1882, 1883, then 1885 to 1900. He passed away in 1906, aged 69. Stand Watie. Many people believed the Confederate Army was made up of only white men, but not only did black men and slaves have roles in the Confederate Army, their roles consisted of only manual labor until the last month of the war when black men were allowed to enlist as soldiers. Many native tribes sided with either the Union or Confederate in an attempt to gain land rights if they joined the winning side. The Cherokee Nation sided with the Confederates, and Stand Watie became the only native Confederate general in the war. He commanded a force of Cherokee, Muskogee, and Seminole soldiers, and was the last Confederate general to surrender. After the war, Watie went into exile in the Choctaw Nation as the U.S. government attempted to negotiate terms with multiple different Indian tribes. Watie stayed out of politics and official positions for the remainder of his life, and eventually returned to the Cherokee Nation, where he would pass away in 1871. John C. Breckinridge. John C. Breckinridge began his political career in the Kentucky House of Representatives and worked his way up to become the Vice President of the United States under James Buchanan in 1856. Buchanan is often considered one of the worst presidents ever, and Buchanan and Breckinridge achieved very little while in office. Breckinridge ran as Lincoln's main opponent in the 1860 presidential election and won 11 states and 72 electoral votes, but failed to beat Lincoln. Breckinridge then joined the Senate, but was expelled shortly after the war began for joining the Confederate Army. Breckinridge served as a major general and took part in many notable battles, and nearing the end of the war was appointed Secretary of War. Realizing all hope of winning was lost, Breckinridge encouraged President Davis to surrender. Upon the Confederate surrender, Breckinridge fled the country for 3 years, but returned after President Johnson pardoned Confederate leaders. Many encouraged Breckinridge to re-enter politics, but war injuries, old age, and alcoholism had taken a toll on Breckinridge's body, and he passed away in 1875, just 10 years after the war had ended. David L. Yulee. David L. Yulee, like Judah P. Benjamin, was born in the U.S. Virgin Islands to Sephardic Jewish parents. He moved to Florida with his family, where he began a successful career as a plantation owner and railroad executive. He served as a U.S. Senator from 1845 to 1851, and again from 1855 to 1860. Sources often debate Yulee's involvement in Confederate politics, but most sources state that he served in the Confederate Congress and as Secretary of the Confederate Navy. After the war, Yulee served 9 months imprisonment in Fort Pulaski for aiding in President Davis's escape from Union forces. After he was pardoned by President Johnson, Yulee became president of multiple railway companies and is often called the father of Florida railroads. In 1870, President Grant and Yulee met in Florida. Yulee continued working in the rail industry before eventually retiring in 1880 and passing away 6 years later in New York City. Like I said at the end of my previous video, there are literally hundreds of Confederate leaders and generals who I would love to talk about, but I just don't want to make this video too long, both for your enjoyment and because YouTube doesn't push my longer videos as much as they do my shorter ones. That being said, if you still want more and would like to see a part 3, please let me know and I will definitely make that. Or on my previous video, I got quite a few requests for a video in this style, but with Union generals and leaders. So if you think that sounds more interesting, let me know and I will make that. But thank you very much for watching. And if you don't mind, feel free to like and subscribe as it really helps a lot. Have a great day.